The morning mist hung low over the Scottish hills like a gray blanket, and Maura MacLeod could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on her shoulders. She stood in her small stone cottage, staring at the ancient weapon that had belonged to her family for generations. The mace was not just any ordinary tool. It was a symbol of leadership, carved from oak wood and topped with iron, that had been forged by her great-great-grandfather's own hands. Maura ran her fingers along the worn handle, remembering all the stories her grandfather had told her before he passed away last winter. He had been the clan leader for over 30 years, making decisions that kept their people safe and fed through good times and bad. Now, at 19 years old, she was the last of her bloodline, and the responsibility of finding the next leader fell on her shoulders. The tradition was simple but challenging. Any man who wanted to lead their clan had to prove his strength by holding the heavy mace steady, while the village elders sang the old song. The song wasn't short either. It told the story of their ancestors, their battles, their victories, and their struggles. It took nearly 10 minutes to sing from start to finish, and in all those minutes, the mace could not waver, shake, or drop even once. Maura had watched this ceremony 12 times in the past 2 years. 12 men had stepped forward, confident and proud, believing they had what it took to lead. There was Ian the blacksmith, whose arms were thick as tree trunks from working the forge all day. He lasted 3 minutes before the mace slipped from his sweating hands. Then came Duncan the hunter, who could shoot a deer from 100 yards away and carry its weight on his shoulders 4 miles. He managed 5 minutes before his arms gave out completely. Each failure had been the same story. The men would start strong, holding the mace high with big smiles on their faces, nodding to the crowd as if victory was already theirs. But as the song continued, as the weight became too much to bear, their confidence would crack. First came the slight trembling in their arms, then the sweat would start pouring down their faces. Their breathing would become heavy and labored. Finally, their muscles would give up entirely, and the mace would crash to the ground with a loud thud that echoed across the village square. The truth was, Maura had begun to hope that no one would succeed, not because she didn't want a leader for her people, but because none of the men who had tried seemed to understand what they were really asking for. They saw the challenge as a simple test of muscle strength, like lifting a heavy stone or carrying a sack of grain. They didn't realize that holding the mace meant holding the weight of every person in their village, their hopes, their fears, their futures. The potato crops had been failing in Ireland for 2 years now, and everyone knew the same sickness that was destroying plants there would eventually reach Scotland. People were already talking in worried whispers about what would happen when their own food started running out. They needed someone who could make hard decisions, someone who could negotiate with the English landlords, someone who could keep families together when everything around them was falling apart. As Maura prepared for today's ceremony, she heard the sound of cartwheels on the rocky path leading to their village. Through her small window, she could see a stranger approaching, a man she had never seen before. He was tall but not massive, with brown hair and clothes that showed he worked with his hands for a living. His cart was simple and well-maintained, pulled by a sturdy horse that looked healthy and cared for. The stranger stopped his cart near the village well and began speaking with old William, who ran the grain store. Even from a distance, Maura could see that this man was different from the others who had come before. He wasn't loud or boastful. He didn't pound his chest or flex his muscles to impress anyone. Instead, he listened carefully when William spoke, nodding thoughtfully and asking questions that seemed to show genuine interest in their village and his people. Word spread quickly through the small community that another man had come to attempt the challenge. By afternoon, the entire village had gathered in the square, just as they had so many times before. The elderly women brought their knitting and settled on wooden benches. The children ran around playing games, occasionally stopping to stare at the stranger with curious eyes. The men crossed their arms and examined the newcomer, trying to guess whether he would last longer than the others. Maura walked to the center of the square, carrying the mace in both hands. It weighed 43 pounds, heavy enough to challenge even the strongest arms. but not so heavy that it was impossible to hold. The weight was carefully chosen by her ancestors to test not just strength, but determination and endurance. The village elder, a white-haired man named Hamish who had been singing the traditional songs since before Moira was born, took his place. Beside her, the crowd fell silent, as they always did before the ceremony began. Even the children stopped their games and watched with wide eyes. The stranger stepped forward and introduced himself simply as Thomas Sinclair from the valley beyond the eastern hills. His voice was calm and steady, without the nervous energy that had marked the previous challengers. When he looked at Moira, his eyes showed respect rather than conquest, as if he understood that she was not a prize to be won, but a partner in responsibility. As Moira prepared to place the mace in his hands, she found herself studying his face more carefully than she had with the others. There was something different about him, something that made her heart beat a little faster. Maybe it was the way he had listened to old William earlier, or the way he had gently patted his horse before securing it for the night. Maybe it was simply that he had not spent the afternoon boasting about his strength, or making promises about what he would do as leader. The moment was approaching when she would find out whether Thomas Sinclair was just another man who would fail, or someone who truly understood the weight he was asking to carry. Moira lifted the heavy mace and looked into Thomas's eyes one final time. Before placing it in his hands, she had done this same action 12 times before, and each time she had seen the same thing, confidence that would slowly turn into panic as the weight became too much to bear. But when she looked at Thomas, she saw something different. His eyes were calm, almost peaceful, as if he had already accepted whatever was about to happen. The moment the mace touched his palms, Moira expected to see his arms shake slightly under the sudden weight. That's how it always started with the others, a small tremor that would grow bigger and bigger until they couldn't hold on anymore. But Thomas's hands closed around the handle with steady certainty. His arms adjusted to the weight without any visible struggle, and his feet planted firmly on the ground in a stance that looked natural and balanced. Old Hamish cleared his throat and began the ancient song in his deep, weathered voice. The words were in the old language that their grandparents had spoken, telling the story of their people's journey to this valley hundreds of years ago. The song spoke of battles fought and won, of harsh winters survived, of children born and elders who had passed their wisdom down through generations. As the first verse continued, Moira watched Thomas carefully. Usually by this point, the men would be breathing harder, their faces starting to show strain. But Thomas looked almost relaxed. His breathing was steady and even. His shoulders remained level and strong. The mace stayed perfectly still in his grip, as if it belonged there. The village crowd had started this ceremony with the usual mix of hope and doubt. They had seen too many failures to get truly excited about another attempt. But as the song moved into its second verse, something changed in the air. People began to lean forward, whispering to each other in amazed voices. Even the children stopped fidgeting and stared at the man holding the mace, as if they were witnessing something magical. Moira felt her heart beating faster as she realized what was happening. For the first time in 2 years, someone was actually succeeding. Thomas wasn't just holding the mace, he was making it look easy. There was no desperate gritting of teeth, no visible struggle against the weight. Instead, he seemed to understand that fighting against the mace would only make it heavier. He had found a way to work with it, to let it rest in his hands without trying to force his strength against its weight. As the song reached its halfway point, old Hamish began to sing, louder and slower, as if he too was amazed by what he was seeing. The words told of the great flood that had nearly destroyed their village 50 years ago, and how the people had worked together to rebuild everything they had lost. Thomas's expression grew more serious as he listened to these words, but his grip on the mace never wavered. By the 6th minute, even Moira had to admit she was holding her breath. None of the previous men had made it this far. Ian the blacksmith had given up at 3 minutes. Duncan the hunter had lasted 5. But here was Thomas, still standing strong with no signs of giving up. Sweat was finally beginning to show on his forehead, but his arms remained steady and his stance stayed firm. The crowd had grown completely silent now, as if speaking might somehow break whatever spell was keeping Thomas strong. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing through the village square. The only sound was Hamish's voice carrying the ancient words across the gathered people, weaving the story of their ancestors with the hope of their future. As the song entered its final verses, telling of the great leaders who had guided their people through times of plenty and times of want, Thomas closed his eyes and seemed to draw strength from somewhere deep inside himself. The mace, which had defeated so many strong men before him, appeared to have found its match at last. When Hamish sang the final note and let his voice fade into the mountain air, Thomas still stood there, holding the mace as steadily as he had. When the song began, for a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then slowly, Thomas opened his eyes and looked at Mora with a small, tired smile that seemed to say he understood exactly what he had just accomplished. The cheering that erupted from the village crowd was unlike anything Mora had ever heard. People jumped to their feet, embracing each other and laughing with pure joy. Children ran around the square shouting with excitement. Even the elderly women who had watched so many failures were wiping tears from their eyes and smiling broadly. But as Thomas carefully handed the mace back to Mora, she saw something in his face that the celebrating crowd had missed. While everyone else was focused on his victory, Thomas looked almost worried, as if he was just beginning to understand what he had gotten himself into. The successful completion of the challenge meant much more than just proving his strength. According to their ancient traditions, he was now bound to share the leadership of their clan with Mora, and that responsibility would begin immediately, within 3 days of the ceremony. Thomas learned just how quickly that responsibility would be tested. A messenger arrived from the eastern villages with terrible news. The same plant disease that had been destroying crops in Ireland had finally reached their part of Scotland. The messenger spoke of entire fields turning black overnight, of families who had lost their entire winter food supply in a matter of days. Thomas found himself sitting in Mora's cottage that evening, surrounded by maps and papers, trying to understand the full scope of what they were facing. Mora had spread out charts showing which families had the largest food stores, which fields might still be saved, and which neighboring villages they could turn to for help. The romantic courtship that should have followed his victory in the mace ceremony was replaced by urgent planning sessions and difficult decisions about survival. As they worked late into the night, Mora watched Thomas transform before her eyes. The quiet stranger who had arrived just days ago was becoming a leader, who asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to every answer. When she explained that the English landlords controlled most of the good farmland, he didn't get angry or make threats like some of the previous challengers would have done. Instead, he asked about their personalities, their business interests, and what might motivate them to help rather than hinder their people's survival. Their first real test came when Lord Patterson, the English landowner who controlled the largest farms in their valley, arrived with an ultimatum. He offered to sell them grain at triple the normal price, claiming that the shortage made such prices necessary. Most of the village elders were ready to agree, desperate to secure food for the coming winter regardless of the cost. But Thomas surprised everyone by asking for a day to consider the offer. That night, he and Mora rode to 3 neighboring villages, speaking with their leaders about joining together to negotiate better prices. By the next morning, they had formed an alliance of 4 villages that could pool their resources and bargaining power. When Lord Patterson returned expecting an easy agreement, he instead found himself facing a united group that politely but firmly countered his offer. Thomas spoke for them all, explaining that they were willing to pay fair prices for grain, but that his people's survival was not an opportunity for profit. The negotiation lasted hours, but in the end, they secured enough grain for the winter at prices their villages could actually afford. As word of this success spread, Mora began to see Thomas in a completely new light. The mace had tested his physical strength for 10 minutes, but real leadership meant carrying the weight of difficult decisions every single day. And so far, Thomas was proving that he understood the difference between being strong and being wise. Their courtship was becoming something neither of them had expected. A partnership forged not in romance, but in the shared responsibility of keeping their people alive and hopeful during the darkest time anyone could remember. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones and stay there. Snow began falling in October and didn't stop for weeks. The village that had celebrated Thomas's victory just months earlier now faced its darkest hour. The potato disease had spread faster and wider than anyone had imagined, destroying not just their crops but those of every village within 100 miles. Thomas stood at his window before dawn each morning, watching the snow pile higher against the cottages. Inside, Moira would be already awake, sitting by the fire and going through their carefully kept records of food supplies. They had divided their people into groups based on need. Families with young children, elderly people who needed extra care, and able-bodied adults who could survive on smaller portions. Every decision they made meant the difference between life and death for someone they had known all their lives. The ceremonial mace now hung on the wall of their shared cottage, but Thomas rarely looked at it anymore. That 10-minute test seemed like child's play compared to the weight he carried now. Every morning brought new problems that required solutions he wasn't sure he could find. Mrs. Campbell's baby was getting sick because she wasn't producing enough milk. She needed more food, but giving her extra meant taking it from someone else. Old Robert's arthritis was getting worse in the cold. He needed medicine they couldn't afford. The Henderson family was talking about leaving for the cities down south, but Thomas knew that meant they would probably never return. 3 weeks into December, English government officials arrived with an offer that split the village right down the middle. They would provide free passage to America for any families willing to leave permanently. The ships would take them to New York, where they promised there was plenty of work and land for everyone. But there was a catch. Anyone who accepted the offer had to sign papers giving up all rights to return to Scotland ever. The village meeting that night was the most heated Thomas had ever witnessed. Families were shouting at each other across the small church where they had gathered. Some people saw the offer as their only chance for survival. Others viewed it as abandonment of everything their ancestors had built. Children cried as their parents argued. Elderly people who had never raised their voices in anger found themselves standing up and yelling at neighbors they had known for decades. Thomas sat quietly through most of the arguing, listening carefully to every concern and every fear. Moira watched him from across the room, knowing that whatever decision they made together would change their community forever. When the shouting finally died down, everyone turned to look at Thomas, waiting for the wisdom they hoped he possessed. He stood up slowly and walked to the front of the church. For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked at the faces of people who had become his responsibility. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. The decision they reached that night was one that would be remembered for generations. Thomas and Moira proposed splitting their community, the families with the least food, the oldest people, and those with young children who needed the most care would take the ship to America. The stronger adults, the people with some resources left, and those who felt they couldn't leave their ancestral home would stay behind and work to rebuild. It was a solution that satisfied no one completely, but one that everyone could live with. Thomas volunteered to personally escort the departing families to the port city of Greenock, a journey that would take weeks in winter conditions. Moira would stay behind to organize the remaining villagers and manage their limited supplies. Through the rest of the winter. The night before the departure, Thomas walked through the village one final time. He helped families pack their few belongings, carried children who were too tired to walk, and listened to the fears and hopes of people who were about to leave everything they had ever known. Some of the departing families gave him letters to send to relatives they might never see again. Others pressed small treasures into his hands, a carved wooden cross, a lock of hair from a deceased parent, a ring that had been in their family for generations. As the loaded carts rolled away from the village in the gray morning light, Thomas realized that carrying the ceremonial mace for 10 minutes had been preparation for this moment, not because of the physical strength it required, But because of what it had taught him about endurance, true leadership wasn't about being strong enough to hold something heavy for a short time. It was about being willing to carry an impossible weight for as long as your people needed you to carry it. 15 years had passed since that terrible winter, and the village square looked very different now. New cottages had been built where old ones had fallen into disrepair. Gardens that had been destroyed by disease now flourished with healthy crops. Children who hadn't even been born during the crisis now ran around playing the same games there. Parents had played, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Thomas stood in the doorway of what had once been his and Moira's cottage, but was now home to their own growing family. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, were helping their mother prepare for the evening meal. The youngest, barely 5 years old, was trying to help by setting wooden bowls on the table, though he kept dropping them in his eagerness to be useful. Letters had arrived that morning from America, as they did every few months. The families who had made the journey across the ocean 15 years ago had not just survived, they had thrived. They wrote of towns they had helped build, of farms that produced more food than they could eat, of children who had grown up and started families of their own. They sent money when they could, and always asked for news of the people who had stayed behind. The village had thrived too, in its own way. The crisis had taught them to work together in ways their ancestors had never imagined. They had developed new methods of preserving food, new ways of sharing resources, new traditions of helping each other through difficult times. Thomas's leadership had evolved from making emergency decisions to helping the community grow and prosper. As evening approached, Thomas walked to the village square where a small crowd was gathering. Word had spread that another young man wanted to attempt the ceremonial challenge. This one was from their own village, Robert McLeod, the son of one of the families that had stayed through the crisis. He was 22 years old, strong from years of farm work, and known throughout the village for his kind heart and quick mind. Moore arrived carrying the same mace that Thomas had held all those years ago. It looked exactly the same worn wooden handle, the same iron head that had been forged by her ancestors. But Thomas knew that both he and Moira understood its meaning differently now. The mace wasn't just a test of physical strength. It was a symbol of commitment, of the willingness to bear responsibility not just for a few minutes, but for a lifetime. As the ceremony began, an old Hamish started singing the ancient song. In his increasingly frail voice, Thomas found himself remembering that day when he had first taken the mace in his hands. He had been nervous then, uncertain about what he was getting himself into. Now he understood that no one could ever truly prepare for the weight of leadership. You could only prove that you were willing to carry it, no matter how heavy it became. Young Robert held the mace steady throughout the song, just as Thomas had done 15 years earlier, when the final note faded away. The crowd cheered just as enthusiastically as they had for Thomas. But Thomas noticed something that the celebrating villagers might have missed. The look of serious understanding that crossed Robert's face as he handed the mace back to Moira. That evening, as Thomas helped Robert begin to understand the responsibilities he had just accepted, he realized that the true legacy of the ceremonial mace wasn't the strength to hold it briefly. It was the wisdom to understand that once you picked it up, in a sense, you never really put it down again. The weight became part of you, shaping every decision you made and every action you took for the rest of your life. And perhaps, Thomas thought as he watched his own children playing in the firelight, that was exactly how it should be.